On today's episode of the Antediluvian Landfill, we're going to answer the age-old question of what is the dimpled stone and what is it for. We're also going to talk about the vast majority of artifacts that I'm finding that are connected to this prehistoric advanced civilization.
No way.
I have finally found data that I can point to, and not just, hey, look at this rock. So we're going to get into that. We're going to teach you guys how to identify these things, and we're also going to give you the data. So stick around. I would like to start off the video by telling you a story. And this story is in an imaginary world. And in this imaginary world, in their prehistoric time, they had an advanced civilization. And in this advanced civilization, it was called New York Buddhistan. So, New York Buddhistan, in this imaginary world, see, it's prehistoric and it's very advanced. So advanced that they have capabilities that we can't understand in our modern time. But in New York Buddhistan, they have a king. And this king decreed that everybody should have a Buddha, both fat and skinny. And all these Buddhas need to be in specific dimensions. They can be any material, any size. However, they need to be specific dimensions. Because if we get a little crazy with our dimensions, they don't look like Buddha anymore. Fat Buddha doesn't look like fat Buddha. He might look like, welterweight Buddha or skinny fat Buddha. So in this imaginary world, we have a decree where everybody is required to have these effigies. And surely there's craftsmen and artisans that made these things, and it was their job to do so. I can only imagine at that time being one of these artisans, because I'm a fabricator myself. My job for 20 years was to fabricate aircraft parts. I worked on A-10s and HH-60s and C-130s, and I deployed a couple times and had a couple adventures. But I know what it means to fabricate. I know what it means to make stuff. So in this imaginary world, there had to be artisans that fabricated things. And so when they were decreed to make their Buddhas, they made sure that they got their dimensions right. Because the official decree was sent out, right? They sent out this official decree. Everybody's Buddha just must be these dimensions, or it's not Buddha. And that makes sense, especially coming from a military perspective. Anybody that's spent any time in the military understands that there's these ridiculous regulations that are there for one reason or another. Civilians really don't, live that kind of lifestyle, but regulations are very, very present in authoritarian situations. And so I can only imagine that if such a civilization had existed with such a king, right, he would want his image, whether it was young Elvis or old Elvis or skinny Buddha or fat Buddha. I mean, I guess it'd be the same thing, right? Whichever one, he would want his image everywhere. So our imaginary fabricator is required to make these things for people out of whatever materials. The only requirements are they fall under those dimensions. Now, let's fast forward. Let's say this society existed and it was destroyed, much like the stories of our world, a flood, let's say. In this imaginary ancient world, that flood would take all those items that the fabricators made and they would just put them through absolute hell. They would be unrecognizable. And fast forward 13,000 years or whatever the number is, and you have just rocks and dirt and crap. You have nothing. There's nothing left. But not absolutely nothing. You see, our Buddha's geometry existed. They sent out the decree that all Buddhas be the same dimensions, no matter how big or small, whether it was a fat or skinny Buddha, as long as it was within the dimensions to show that Buddha. And fast forward 13,000 years, whatever it is, the only thing that's left is the geometry of the fragments. They're so beat to hell that you can't show faces, you can't show carvings as much as you'd hope. But what is there is the geometry. The geometry exists. And that's what I've discovered. You see, all these things, as I was about to start sharing my collection and get into, you know, video 2 about the things I found, I was essentially looking at just showing you rocks and being like, hey man, look, don't they look kind of the same, right? I mean, yeah. And that was kind of ridiculous. But what else did I have? You know, they just look the same. But, you know, as a fabricator, as somebody that has spent time drafting and creating parts from sheet metal, and I thought, well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the ones that are the most similar and I'm just going to lay them out just as I would a part. So just like you would drafting or any type of old school architecture drawing, I started laying out these parts as if they were blueprints. I started realizing that they were the same. Now, how are they the same? Well, you can't even really see what's on the table that great. I just lost the light. You know, I really suck at this YouTube thing, so we're blaming that on Jimmy from Bright Insight. However, these things are the same because their basic geometry is exact. The first thing I discovered, I started working on the triangular pieces because, you know, if you're gonna lay something out, triangle, right? Easy, okay. So I start laying out my triangles, and I notice, well, hey man, that bad boy's 40 solid degrees. And so I got the other ones and started comparing, and well, wait, not all of them were 40 degrees. Some were, well, 60 degrees. And then I realized, well, all of the triangles I have are either 40 or 60 degrees. Wow, that's interesting. And I started looking at everything else, and from an artistic perspective, from a fabrications perspective, the overall general lines of these pieces are exact. They're spot on. 40 degrees, 80 degrees, 60 degrees, 20 degrees, 140 degrees. There's no in between. These things, if you were to lay out a blueprint for an artist or a fabricator to create one of these things and include all the radius lines, you would still have that straight degree. You would still have those solid numbers. They exist everywhere. So for example, one of the most common ones that we have is this shape right here. Now this guy I've seen everywhere. And in fact, it was in the first submission that we've had. The individual sent a handful of photos, and we'll discuss them in a minute. But in it was this common shape. And I can show you just as simply in China, you know, one of those, look at this old man. He's trying to sell this stone for $200, you know, whatever that voice is, the social media voice. And I noticed, you know, whatever poor Asian man that they're using for this video has the stone in his hand. And it is literally this version of Artifact. Now, this common version happens to be 40 degrees, the body, and 80 degrees for the mouth. And I realized as I was, you know, doing, back up. I realized as I was doing the bodies that this one that was the 40, 80 or 40 degrees, I noticed its mouth, and I was able to measure it because it was quite clear. So I got the protractor. I don't know. I'm tired. It's late. I got out my instruments, my measuring instruments, and discovered that the mouth was exactly 80 degrees. And that inspired me to go down the line and check all these. And really what seems to happen is not all of these you can see the mouths. Certain ones you can because the mouths are part of the exterior shape, but not all of them. You know, some of them are faint lines, but in all of these I've been able to find one that I can measure and say, you know, confidently that is the degree for the mouth. So I've been able to identify exact measurements for all these categories. And I've chosen categories that most people have, and that most individuals seem to post online and say, what is this? Or, everybody's like, oh, it's just a rock, you're crazy. And other people are like, oh, it's a native, cupping stone. Oh, but so we're going to go through those briefly, and then we're going to get into what's actually up with this. And it's, in fact, it's my mistake to jump into this without even discussing why we're here in the first place. So these triangles are common things that we find, and everybody has this big collection of rocks that nobody really knows what anything is. Well, I know what it is. And why do I know what it is? I know what it is because I found a fossilized version of these that is complete. I found this along with another tablet. The tablet has a snake consuming a star on it. This happens to be what appears to be a feathered serpent. I have feathers on it. It's consuming a star, and all its carvings are there. I can see where it's broken off its mount. It tells me a lot. It tells me that we're dealing with snakes eating stars. And as I analyze these items, you start to discover, oh man, I can see where these stars were. I can see where they were in the mouths. And so over time, I've looked at this for a year. Over time, after finding these pieces, I've been able to collect enough to find enough evidence on these pieces to say, okay, yes, this is what this is, and this is what that is. So in other words, this is just like basic of my collection. I have so much more than this because you collect 10,000 pieces and then you get a basic idea of what one thing is. I don't know if that makes sense, but the sum gives you the idea. It's not just the individual rock, because most people will find just one of these things and they'll be like, yeah, I don't know what it is, it's just a shape. I mean, what do you do with that? But if you get like 50 of them and you look at them together, well, some markings exist here and some markings exist there. So essentially, I've been able to determine what these are, and they're all the same thing. We're dealing with an ancient society that really loved snakes eating stars or feathered dragons. And the best I can determine is that's some ancient society that, I don't even want to say it. I don't think I'm not going to, this is so stupid. I don't even want to tell you what I've come up like. This is, I can't deal with this stuff. Like this, like really, I'm getting overwhelmed because what this is shouldn't be. What I've uncovered shouldn't exist. It's not. I'm sorry. My mind's just blown. It's too much. It's too much to convey at this time. So we're just gonna run with that. We've got this ancient civilization, and it's very vast, and it's very verifiable. So you guys should be able to go into your natural environments and find exactly what I'm talking about, or variations of what I'm talking about.
No way.
Okay, starting out, we got the triangles. And one thing I'd like to point out is it's one of the things that people pick up the most, because it's so clear that it's uh, not natural. A lot of these edges are pretty sharp and solid. Like nature doesn't do that. Nature doesn't create these perfect triangles in this way. Yeah, it creates triangles, but not like this, not repetitive. And so people pick these up and they carry them along, and they happen to be tipped over. They happen to be 40-80. So the first one is the most common triangle, and it's a 40-80. So the 40-degree body and an 80-degree mouth. Now these mouths, again, I've done my best to verify the degrees, and I'm pretty confident that I'm on. The next one is our next triangle that happens to be 60-80. Now this one, it's a little bit steeper, but it's pretty much the same thing, And in these triangles, you got to imagine that mouth cut into it, that material would have been used to display stars or other type things, and it's used essentially as a canvas. So you see a triangle and you think, oh, it's just a triangle, but in reality, there's a mouth in there. It's a shape for a reason, and all these are this way for a reason. They also have a sister version that has a point to the face. And what that point actually is material existing so that the tongue can be drawn in. Moving along, one of the most common ones that I see online is this radiused version of a 4080, we'll say, and actually happen to have a good version where you can clearly see the mouth. Now, the 2060 happens to be the one that I have the fossilized statue of, or the fossilized portion that is protected and completely there. It appears to be a feathered serpent eating a star. So if you find any version of this, rest assured, feathered serpent eating a star. My version that's complete, feathered serpent. That's what's there. It kind of looks, it's got the dog vibe going on like the Chinese serpents. Moving along, this is the 8080 is another common one I see online. You see this material sticking out of the center of this V shape. And that material actually happens to be the remnant of a star, because all these things happen to be snakes eating stars. So what that is the remnant of star material, or what the artist used to display or portray a star. Interestingly, one of those that I'm showing you happens to be copper and came from Michigan. I've been scouring all over the internet, like looking for sales of these things in other locations to kind of try to prove my point, because a lot of this stuff I'm finding just here in my local area abundantly. And I'm finding metal fragments in other parts of the world that are almost identical in vibe, let's say, and geometry to what we're looking at. So this 8080, pretty popular, and you'll see, and a lot of people have them in their collection. This 6080 is a little bit bizarre because it has almost like, I thought it was like a sandworm vibe, but it's more like a seahorse thing. I don't know. It's very interesting. It's another one that I have a copper. This is a Michigan copper piece. So we've got West Virginia items that bear the exact same geometry. They have the same vibe going on, like it appears to be the same depiction. And then we've got a copper Michigan float, whatever you want to call it, that is just perfectly carved to look like my rock. Okay, whatever. More common ones, the 4080. This one I've got a pretty good example of. There's really good carvings in this one. You can see it pretty well. Another fantastically common, the 6080. I see a lot of these, and people can't, put together. I act like I know, right? Like I'm some, I don't know, savant. Did my thing fall over? It did. I act like I'm super educated on this, but it's like I just figured this stuff out. I don't know what I'm doing. I'll just leave it. Then, okay. I act like I know what I'm doing, but all these things are conclusions that I'm confident in, and once it clicks, it's just like, oh my gosh, you can see it everywhere, and it's actually overwhelming because it implies a multitude of people, which is a little bit freaky because we'll get into that later. But anyways, these items, you see a whole lot. People always wonder what they are, and it's just more of the same thing, just different dimensions. More of the same thing because I've found ones that have the eyes on them. I've got ones that have the, the mouths are actually cut into them, and the thinner version's not. Now, man, all these are really common. The 8140s are fun because they've got, you can clearly see the mouth. My kid drew in this one. I tried to contract her to do some drawings for me for this thing, and I was like, hey, I need like blueprint style, and she's like, yeah, draw on face. Ugh. And that's what I got back, so she didn't get paid. Anyway, okay, 8140, those are pretty cool, and they come in a bunch of different shapes. They have different vibes to them, but ultimately all those are 80-degree bodies or 80-degree heads. These are all heads virtually. 80-degree heads and 140-degree mouth openings. And the mouth openings are actually cut into the piece, whereas the other ones, a lot of them were painted or carved. Okay, 2140s, these are common, and I've seen them in other places in the world, and it actually takes me to fractals. I want to stop for a minute and talk about fractals. So any wannabe crypto trader understands what a fractal is, and ultimately what a fractal is just a smaller version inside a larger version of that same thing. It's a geometric situation, and a lot of times it's displayed by triangles with inside triangles, or squares with inside squares, and the infinite ability to go into that smaller or larger. What I'm seeing in this stuff is fractals. And what I mean is that after I've learned all these shapes and I've spent all this time documenting and learning, I go out into nature and I'm realizing they come in all sizes and they're exact. So what I'm suggesting is that the 6080 in theory should exist somewhere else in this world much larger than this little one on my table. I have multiple sizes of the same thing, and I end up running into things in nature that are just humongous that bear the same general geometry. So I can only assume that this exists in a fractal state. This artistic perspective was very complex. It was very much geometric perfection. I look at these things as somebody that has to make them, and a lot of people don't get that perspective. A lot of people can't get that perspective because they don't have that opportunity. But looking from that perspective, I can assure you that these things are incredible. I can assure you that they are correct, they are exact, and it takes an incredible amount to make what's here. And there is an incredible amount out there for you to go find. The reason I'm making these videos is so you guys can go verify for yourselves what it is that I'm saying, because this is so abundant. You should be able to go to your local creek in your local, as long as you live in the United States, primarily the East Coast of the United States, you should be able to go out into your local areas and verify what it is I'm saying. So as we continue to learn these things that you can verify, you can go out into the wild, get a protractor, go out there, look at these shapes, save them on your phone, and go check it out. I'm going to post them on Instagram later. But anyways, going back to it, these 4040s over here, I pulled out of a hillside. They're excavating a complete mountain, essentially, in my local area. And I took the opportunity to snoop around and see what was coming out of it. And loads of content for the future, let me tell you. I have found some amazing stuff. And out of that was a lot of artifacts that were undamaged, to include wooden artifacts. I can prove that later. I have videos of where I got them, and I pulled them out of the dirt ball that I did where the excavator was. But for now, just trust me that I happen to have wooden examples of some of these artifacts, which means carbon dating. Do you understand? We can find out exactly, or at least, however accurate that is, when this society existed, or at minimum, the latest. These wood fragments, I have multiples that are 100% part of this culture. Maybe I could, raise some money. I fit the bill myself. I just want to know for myself, honestly, for my own desires. I would love to know what date frame this comes from. But I know. I don't know. I can know. We can know. We can figure this out. We have some hard evidence. That's incredible. I also found a bone. Getting into that later. That's another super creep fest. Blah. Anyway, 4040s, pulled these out of the mountain. They were really great. And what I noticed is the area where I was pulling these out of the mountain, like all these things that have all this diverse collection, and I'm really getting them from a dredge operation out of the Ohio River. They just put them in, the garden centers, and you just dig through the piles of rocks. It's like, sifted, congregated artifacts, essentially, is what you're dealing with. But they're so beat up because they've been in the river. However, when you pull them out of the earth in the local area, they're in much better shape. And some of these 4040s happen to be in decent shape. But what I noticed was that was a lot of what I was finding in the area. It was almost like that was the only thing around there. I did find other things, but the vast majority of it was this 4040. In nature, be looking down, because the stuff's in the creeks, the stuff in the creek beds and in the rivers is damaged, right? But the stuff that has been preserved in the dirt and on the hillsides, keep an eye out, because things will start peeking out that are much better shape than what you'll find in the rivers. Moving on, the 4080 was actually one that came out of the same area, and they kind of have the same vibe, but I determined overall that they do have different angled mouths, 4080, 4040. And the 4080, so I have a good example of the 4080 that is just beat up. It's like it went through the cataclysm and stopped. It didn't go through the river process. And so all those jagged edges are still kind of there, and you can kind of see in a good way like what it kind of looked like. But what's even more interesting is I have an aluminum version. This also came out of Michigan. This is another one of those. There's a lot of metallic stuff going on in Michigan, but that little aluminum fragment happens to fall into my categories. I have lots of examples of aluminum from this culture. I have lots of examples of copper from this culture. I see lots of examples of these things that fit these dimensions on the prospecting, gold nugget videos and stuff. It's all the same thing. So what I'm essentially telling you is that the vast majority of stones, nuggets, and bizarre things found in our environment are just remnants of this society. Those nuggets shouldn't look like this. They should, be completely, random shapes, but they're not random. I shouldn't be able to reproduce a nugget with a stone. Like, it just doesn't recreate nature like that. I'm sorry, like it's too much of a coincidence. The exact geometry, it's sacred geometry. What does Graham Hancock and what's his nuts? I can't remember. But yeah, geometry. That's what is correct. That is the quantifiable thing in all this. That's the thing that you can check. That's the thing you can verify. Next up is the 8080. This one happens to be appearing as if the snake head is striking or in a full extended open position. It happens to be one of the ones that I have a wood fragment of. And this is, again, one of those ones that was pulled out of that dirt ball. But the interesting thing that I discovered was that some of these wooden fragments, as I grabbed them, the designs were there. But as I began to handle them, they just faded away, almost as if whatever material was used to create the designs on these wood fragments was biodegradable, and it's turned to dirt. So it could possibly be paper mache or something to that effect, but whatever was on the exterior or the top coat of this thing is what mostly held the designs, and it's gone. So once I determined that that was kind of happening, I did my best not to handle them as much and just leave the dirt as it is. So you might be able to see some designs in that dirt on this wood fragment, but it's largely gone. Now, I would like to point out, while this is an 8080, the thicknesses of these things varies. So almost as if it could be a 2D version or a 3D version. Like this one, for example, is relatively flat, but the one that is just next to it, that's gray, it's a little bit more three-dimensional, if that makes sense. So as you guys go about your own research, keep that in mind, that these things, while I have deemed the 8080 to be just that, the 8080, it could be thick, thin, or any size. In the end, the common denominator in all this is geometry. Okay, the 6080 happens to be another one of those that I deem some kind of missing link. And what I mean by that is it's a piece that helped me figure out what was actually going on. As you look at this thing, if you didn't see any designs on it and you assumed it was some type of statue fragment, the pointy part would seem like the front, like a beak or some kind of nose or something. But that's not the case. It was when I discovered this one that I was able to clearly see the mouth and the shape of the head and the eye. So the pointy part happens to be the back of the neck. And the opposite radius portion would be another one of those star fields, or the area where items would be drawn into it. This happens to be one of those shapes that I see a lot of, and they're really almost never with designs. A lot of them are very flat, and it seems that they were painted.
Alrighty then.
Our last couple items, we get into our dimpled stone here, and it happens to be a 2060. The 20 degree is so sharp that they cut off the end. So the 2060, if you find this stone that you feel like it's something, and it happens to be this interrupted slope, almost certainly it happens to be these 2060s. And the last one I'll talk about is this 2080. I found very good examples of the 2080s of various sizes. And I also have multiple examples of them in copper. This is pretty convincing, guys. You know, this is compelling evidence. These things shouldn't be exactly the same dimensions. Why do all the stones that look similar happen to be exactly the same dimensions unless they happen to be a part of a standardization? Remember New York Buddhistan? All we're looking at is our version of that. Amaruka? I don't know, land of the feathered serpent? All I'm finding is serpents and feathers and stars. And the only thing I can determine is that it's this ancient civilization. So now let's think about our dimpled stone. What's up with that? Well, let's use our brains for a second. We can verify it's a 2060. So this stone happens to fall into one of our categories of this civilization. So let's go ahead and connect this stone with our civilization. We know that these are all heads of snakes. They're virtually all the same thing, just of a different depiction and a different geometry. So it's safe to assume that this is probably the head of a snake or a serpent. So what of these dimples? Well, in my first video, I demonstrated how some of these artifacts, in fact, the vast majority of these artifacts, are so much smaller than they originally were. These artifacts are hundreds of thousands of an inch smaller than their original fabrication size. That means not a lot's left, and a lot of these marks happen to be the deepest points of the carving. And think about that, the deepest point, or a relief, or a negative. So what about our dimpled stone? Well, what happens when we look at it, and we look at those dimples as if they're a negative? What do you begin to see? We know that we found a tablet with a star on a snake eating a star in the beginning. We have a fossilized example of a plumed serpent eating a star. And then all these other exact examples of what seem to be snakes, kind of eating stars as best as we can tell. So those negatives on those holes, I mean, it kind of looks like a star, doesn't it, guys? I mean, really, this is just, logic. This is just reasoning. This is just, it just makes sense. So I submit to you that those dimples are in fact the negatives or the voids of where a star should be. I originally thought that they were inlays, and I was going to, kind of stake my hat on that before I saw it. And because I found other examples of inlays, and most of them being square or some not round shape. And we know that, round inlays pop out a lot easier than square or any type of, angular inlay. And so I thought they were inlays because they happened to be in star locations. But once I got my buddy's stone, because I borrowed this from my buddy, it's not mine, I wish it was, I realized that inside those dimples they happened to be carved also, just like they were carved between the megalith and that rock face that I found in our first video. And so these dimples happened to be carved in their contours. And so I stood back and it just popped out. It was just like that. You could see the star. And it reminded me of what I taught in the first video, is that a lot of these things are the deepest points of carvings. And so it just makes sense that because those dimples happen to be carved in and out, they're not an inlay, because an inlay would have a glued receptacle. It would not be carved. It would have it would be clear. So it's carved, and when you stand back, you can clearly see where the stars were. So it only makes sense that our dimples happen to be stars. Now here's another dimple stone that you can't really tell were stars as good as my friend's stone. And that's because most of it's gone. But I suggest to you that these are the deepest points of this carving. These are the stars, is what we're looking at, or some version of that. So I'm confident in the end that we have now a naming system for these, and we'll be naming them by the geometry which they hold. I'm going to post these on Instagram so everybody can check and verify their own stuff. But I do have more than what I'm showing you here, much more. It's just, what fits on the table and what's a good example. And so I assure you, these things are true. I'm only here because this is true. I do not want to be wasting my time with this. This is extreme information that I couldn't care less about unless it were true. It's too much. But it's fascinating, and it's everywhere, and it's abundant. And that's the most scary thing about all this. When I started to realize that these shapes were consistent, and I started to walk around in nature, the abundance that I found these things in gave me the creeps, because it implied a civilization so vast had to exist to create the amount of items we have in our nature. The amount of artifacts, 80%? Like, I still can't wrap my head around it. It had to have been so many people. So take these that I've given you, go out and try to find them, verify them, and contact me on the Antediluvian Landfill on Instagram, and send me pictures of what you got. Let me know what you have, and let's start cataloging these things and finding out what exactly is going on here. So as far as the viewer submission is concerned, I think we can pretty quickly knock out what those were. A couple of them I am not so sure about, but I'm just gonna leave it for you to decide. They're up on Instagram, and I'm gonna post a couple of them here. And I think that what has been submitted belongs to this culture and is in fact also artifacts. So if you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe and stick around for future content as we unravel this mystery and potentially go to other parts of the world and see if this is connected. Until next time. Whatever.